Cordelia Vance signed the bill of sale on the hood of his Packard out in the yard because Harlan Rethmore wouldn't drink a widow's coffee twice. The ink smeared in the heat. She didn't cry. Earlier, in her kitchen, he'd kept his hat on and set his cup down on her dead husband's Bible to hold a page. Then, on the courthouse steps, before 11 neighbors and the county clerk, he said it loud, "Sign it, ma'am. Dust don't grow money, and neither do widows." Cordelia folded her copy into her apron and said only that she'd read every line, including one paragraph her husband made the lawyer write back in 1919. She didn't say what it was. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Subscribe and comment what city you're watching from. Cordelia Vance set 2 cups on the table that morning, the way she had every morning for 18 months. One for herself, one for Thomas, though Thomas had been under the cottonwood since the winter before last, taken by the dust that got into a man's lungs and would not come out. She poured for both. She drank hers. His went cold, the way it always did. And she poured it back into the pot at noon and thought nothing of it. That was not madness. That was habit, and habit was the last thing the drought could not burn. The Vance section sat in the flat northwest corner of Cottonwood County, western Kansas, 320 acres of ground her father had broken with a walking plow, and her husband had held through 2 wars and 1 flu. Spring, 1936, only the spring did not look like spring. The wheat had come up thin and yellow the year before and burned brown in the field before it made a head. This year it had not come up at all in the west quarter. The dust lay in drifts against the fence posts like dirty snow. When the wind rose out of the southwest, it lifted the topsoil off the ground she owned and carried it to Oklahoma, and gave her back somebody else's in return. She swept the sills twice a day and it did no good. She was 58. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles. She wore her hair the way she had worn it at 30, pinned close, gone gray now at the temples first and then everywhere. She did not think of herself as poor. Though she was, she thought of herself as the third of 3. Her father under the cottonwood, her husband beside him, and her on top of the ground the 2 of them had worked, keeping it warm. The note at the county bank ran $1,140. She knew the figure the way she knew the Lord's Prayer, without having to fetch it up. 60 days, and then the auction on the courthouse steps. And a stranger would buy the ground her father broke for the price of the back taxes. She did the sums by lamplight, and the sums did not change no matter how many times she added them. But she had the walnuts. That was the thing she came back to, the way a tongue comes back to a sore tooth. Down along Sand Creek on the west bank stood a grove of black walnut Thomas had planted the year Silas was born. 19 and 17, that would have been. 60 trees, near enough, set out in careful rows by a man who would not live to see them tall. They were tall now. When everything else on the section was the color of a dead thing, the walnuts came out green along the creek and held their leaves late into the fall, and the hulls dropped and stained the mud black, and the smell of them was the one green smell left in the whole burnt country. "Never sell the walnut, Cordy," she could hear him say it. He had said it more than once, in that dry, flat way he had, standing at the creek with his thumbs in his belt. Trees keep growing when the wheat won't. She had thought it sentiment, a man's fondness for a thing he made with his own hands. She had smiled at it the way a wife smiles at a husband's soft spot, and she had never once thought it was anything but that. She would learn otherwise, but not yet. That spring, she still thought it was only love talking, and she loved him for it. And that was as far as it went. The automobile came up the section road on a Tuesday, throwing a rooster tail of dust behind it that hung in the still air long after it had passed. She saw it from the kitchen window. A Packard, dark green under the film of dirt, the kind of car nobody in Cottonwood County owned. She knew before it stopped what it was. There was only one reason a car like that came out to a farm like hers in a year like this. The man who got out was broad and easy in a gray suit that had cost more than her wheat would bring. He stood a moment looking at the buildings, the sagging barn, the house with its paint gone to bare wood, and she watched him price it all with his eyes before he ever knocked. Then he came to the door and knocked, and she opened it, and he took off his hat, which was the last courtesy she would get from him. "Mrs. Vance," he said it like he already knew her. "Harlan Rethmore, Continental Prairie Land and Development." He had a card. She did not take it, so he set it on the table. "I wonder if I might have a word about your situation." She let him in because there was no reason not to, and because Silas was there, her grandson, 19 years old and folded into the chair by the stove with a harness he was mending. And a man does not misbehave badly with a young man watching. She was wrong about that, but not in the way she expected. Rethmore put his hat back on the moment he was inside. Right there in her kitchen, under her roof, he set that gray hat back on his head as easy as if he were standing on a street corner. She noticed it. She said nothing. A woman raised the way she was raised did not correct a guest, even a guest who did not deserve the name. But she noticed, and Silas noticed, and neither of them said a word. She poured him coffee, because that was what you did. He did not thank her. He talked. He talked about the drought and the price of wheat and the way the whole country out here was blowing away, and he talked about it the way a man talks about weather that will never touch him. And while he talked, he reached across the table and took up a book to hold his figures against, and set his coffee cup down on top of it to mark his place. The book was Thomas's Bible. It sat where it always sat, at the end of the table, the black cover soft with handling, the ribbon still marking the psalm Thomas had been reading the week he died. Rethmore did not know it from a ledger. He set his hot cup on the cover, on the leather her husband's thumbs had worn thin, and a ring of coffee soaked into it while he pushed a paper across the table at her. Cordelia looked at the cup on the Bible. She looked a long moment. Then she looked at the paper, because looking at the cup was not going to move the cup, and she was not yet the kind of woman who knew how to make a man like this move. $600, Rethmore said. For the whole section. 320 acres, all standing and lying, the buildings, the fence, the timber, the ground. Everything on it and under it. 600, cash, and the banknotes settled, and you walk away clear. He tapped the paper with one finger. That's more than this ground will bring at auction, Mrs. Vance, and you know it. Dust doesn't sell. $600. The note was $11.40. She would walk away not merely clear but with nothing. Less than nothing. And he was offering it to her as a kindness and expecting her to take it as one. She did not take up the paper. She folded her hands on the edge of the table and she said, plainly, in a voice steady enough that Silas looked up from the harness, "You should read the whole deed, Mr. Rethmore, not just the front page." Rethmore laughed. It was not an unkind laugh, which somehow made it worse. It was the laugh of a man at a child who has said something quaint. "The whole deed says 320 acres, ma'am. I've read 1,000 of them. They all say the same thing." He drank off his coffee and set the empty cup back on the Bible, a second ring inside the first. "You think about it. I'll come back." He gathered his hat that had never come off, and his card that she had never taken, and he went out to the Packard and drove off down the section road with the dust hanging behind him. Cordelia sat a while. Then she got up and took the coffee cup off the Bible and wiped the leather with her apron, and the stain would not come out, and she knew it would never come out. She put the Bible back in its place with the Psalms still marked. She began to fold the deed away. She had brought it out during the talk. The deed to the section. The paper that said this ground was hers. And as she folded it, her thumb ran across a line low on the second page. A paragraph in different, older ink than the rest. And she said, half to Silas and half to no one. Thomas had the lawyer put in that paragraph about the creek trees back in 19. Fussy about it he was. Made old Fen write it twice. She said it the way you say a thing you have said 100 times and stopped hearing. She folded the deed into the tin box on the shelf and shut the lid and thought no more of it and put the kettle on for her supper. Silas remembered every word of it. He did not know why. He would. Rethmore came back on the Friday, and he did not come alone in the way that matters, though he came alone in the car. He came back with a paper drawn by a lawyer, a proper bill of sale, typed and lined for a signature, and he came back with a lower number. 480, he said, and he said it standing in the yard by the Packard, because this time he did not come inside at all. He had come inside once and drunk her coffee once, and once was evidently his limit for a widow's kitchen. He stood by the green car in the white sun and held the paper against the hood. Titles clouded, Mrs. Vance, there's back taxes on it the company'll have to clear, and that's money out of our end. 480, and it's a fair price for clouded ground, and I'll not go $1 higher. $480. The number fell another 120 from the number that had already been an insult, and it fell for reasons he had invented on the drive out, and there was nothing she could point to and say that is a lie, because clouded and taxes and our end were words a company could always find when it wanted to find them. She stood in her own yard, in the dust that had been her father's ground, and she looked at the paper on the hood of the car of the man who would not come into her house, and she thought about the 60 days, and the auction, and the stranger who would buy it all for the taxes if she did not take even this. 480 settled the note in part. 480 and out was better than nothing and out, by a margin thin as a razor, and Rethmore knew it, and had built the number so that it would be. I'll want to read it first, she said. Read all you like. He handed her the paper and she read it, standing, the wind snapping the corner of it, the sun off the green hood into her eyes. She read every line. It said the described section. It said 320 acres more or less. It said all improvements and appurtenances. It said all standing and growing timber. It was, she saw, a hungry piece of paper, drawn to swallow the whole of everything a person could think of, and it named the section and named the timber and named the ground, and she read it to the last word. And then she signed it. Because the number was better than nothing, and nothing was the only other number on offer. She signed it on the hood of the Packard, bent over the hot green metal, and the ink smeared a little in the heat where her hand dragged. And Rethmore said, There now. That wasn't so hard, and took the paper back and blew on it to dry it, and Cordelia straightened up and looked at him and did not cry. She would not give him that. She had given him the ground. She would keep the water in her eyes. We'll want it recorded proper, Rethmore said, folding the signed sale into his coat. At the courthouse, before the clerk, so there's no question after. Monday, say, you bring your copy of the deed and we'll enter it on the register. He got into the Packard. It's the smart thing you're doing, Mrs. Vance. A person's got to be practical. He drove off. Silas came out of the barn where he had watched the whole of it through the door and stood beside his grandmother in the yard, and neither of them said anything for a while. You read every line, Silas said finally. I read every line, she said. And she was thinking, though she did not say it, of a different line, an older line in older ink that she had folded away in a tin box and had not read closely in 18 years. She did not think of it clearly. She only felt it, the way you feel a coin in a pocket you have not looked in. Monday came hot and still. The courthouse in Cottonwood was a square brick building with a flag hung limp on its pole, and the county clerk's office was on the ground floor, a long counter and a wall of leather register books thick as tombstones. It was a busy morning. It was the last week to pay taxes without penalty, and half the county had come in to pay what they could. And the office was full of farmers in clean shirts holding their money in envelopes, waiting their turn at the counter. 11 of them, near enough, though nobody counted at the time. Cordelia would learn the number later, when the number mattered. She came in with her copy of the deed in her handbag and Silas at her shoulder. Rethmore was already there, leaning on the counter, easy, at home, the way his kind was always at home in the rooms where papers changed hands. He had the bill of sale. The clerk, a thin man named Colley with ink on his cuff, laid the register book open on the counter and dipped his pen and prepared to enter the sale. Mrs. Vance is selling the whole section to Continental Prairie. Rethmore announced, to the clerk and to the room, louder than the business needed. 320 acres. We'll want it entered clear. He slid the bill of sale across the counter. He turned to Cordelia and held out the pen for her to sign the register alongside her mark on the sale, and she reached for it. And the room was quiet with the ordinary quiet of people minding papers. And then Rethmore, because the room was full, because 11 neighbors were standing there with their tax envelopes and their downturned faces, because a man like that could never quite resist an audience. Rethmore said, loud, so it carried the length of the counter and back, "Sign it, ma'am. Dust don't grow money. And neither do widows." The room went still, not the busy still of people at their business. The other kind. The kind where every person in a room hears a thing said that should not have been said, and every person looks at the floor or the wall or the register book, and no one looks at the woman it was said to. Because to look at her would be to have to answer for the man who said it. Collie the clerk looked down at his register. The farmers looked at their envelopes, 11 of them, and not one raised his eyes, and the flag hung limp at the window, and the pen was in Cordelia Vance's hand. She signed. She signed her name on the register in her small even hand, and she signed the bill of sale where Collie showed her. And she took her copy of it folded, and she folded that copy once more. Small. And she put it into the pocket of her apron under her handbag, the way a woman puts away a thing she means to keep. And she stood up straight, 58 years old, gray at the temples, in a room full of men who would not look at her, and she said, quietly, so that the ones nearest heard it, and the ones far off leaned in, I read every line. That was all. Collie stamped the register with the county seal, and the sale was recorded, and the section belonged to Continental Prairie Land and Development, 320 acres, all standing and lying, dust and buildings and timber and ground. Rethmore straightened his coat, satisfied, sensible, he said, to no one. He touched his hat to the clerk, not to her, and went out into the sun. The farmers went back to their envelopes. The morning went on. Cordelia went home. She did the evening chores because the chores did not know the ground had changed hands and would want doing regardless. She fed the few chickens. She milked the one cow. She set 2 cups on the table out of habit and caught herself and set out only one, and then, stubborn, set out the second anyway. She ate her supper. She washed the plate. And when it was full dark and the lamp was lit, she took the tin box down off the shelf. She had not read the deed close in 18 years. There had been no reason to. A deed, once you have it, sits in its box like a birth certificate, proof of a thing already true, and you do not read it again until the day the truth is challenged. Now the truth was sold. She unfolded the old paper carefully at the creases, where the folds had worn near through. And she turned the lamp up and bent to it, and she read past the front page, past the 320 acres more or less, down the legal description of the section by its township and range, down to the second page to the paragraph in the older, darker ink. It was a paragraph Thomas had made the lawyer write. She remembered him fussing over it, back in 1919. The year after the First War, when he had gone in to old Deacon Fenn, who drew all the deeds in that country, and had made Fenn write it, and then write it again, because the first time it did not say it strong enough to suit him. She had thought it a whim. She read it now. Reserving and accepting, the paragraph said, from this conveyance and from any future conveyance of the described section. The stand of black walnut trees, situate upon the west bank of Sand Creek. And here the description ran on, the meats of it, the little strip of ground along the water, the said trees and the ground beneath them to the depth of their roots, reserved unto the grantor Thomas Vance, and unto his heirs and assigns, not to be conveyed or sold with the said section, but held separate and apart. In perpetuity. She read it once and did not understand it. She read it twice and began to. The trees and the ground beneath them to the depth of their roots. Reserved, not to be conveyed with the said section. Held separate and apart. In perpetuity. Never sell the walnut, Cordy, trees keep growing when the wheat won't. She sat very still at the table, with the lamp hissing and the old paper spread flat under her cracked hands, and she understood that her husband, 18 years dead, a man she had thought soft over a stand of trees he had planted with his own hands, had not been soft at all. He had been careful. He had walked into a lawyer's office in 1919 and taken the grove out of the section, cut it clean out of the title, made it a separate thing that belonged to him and to his heirs, and could not be sold along with the dust no matter what paper anybody signed on the hood of any car. She had signed away 320 acres. She had not signed away the grove. She could not have. The grove had not been hers to sign. It had already been taken out of the section 18 years before by a man who had told her, in his dry, flat way, exactly what he was doing, and she had smiled and called it love and never once hurt him. Cordelia Vance sat at her kitchen table in the dark and did not know yet what it meant. She did not know what a stand of 60 black walnut trees was worth in a country going to war, or what a company would do when it came to fell them for a road and found it could not, or what the ground beneath them to the depth of their roots would matter to a highway that had to cross Sand Creek and could cross it nowhere else. She knew none of that yet. She only knew that the paragraph was real, that it was in Thomas's insisted words, that old Fenn had drawn it and might, God willing, still have his copy somewhere in that file box of his. She got up. She folded the deed away, careful at the worn creases, and put it back in the tin box, and put the box back on the shelf. She looked a long moment at the Bible with the coffee ring soaked into its cover, the ring that would not come out, and she thought of the man who had set his cup there, and of the 11 who would not look at her, and of the words about dust and widows said loud in a full room. Then she blew out the lamp. In the morning she would ride to Deacon Fenn's. She had read every line, and one of the lines was going to be worth more than the whole burnt section, though she did not yet know the figure, and neither did the men who had never troubled to read it at all. The road to Deacon Fenn's ran 4 miles east along the section line, and Cordelia Vance drove the old wagon herself, the mare stepping slow through dust that lay in the ruts like flour. She had not slept. She had read the paragraph twice more by the gray light before she hitched the team, and the words held. She kept them folded in her apron the way you keep a coal you mean to blow back to life. Fenn's office sat behind his house at the edge of town. He was near 90 now, his eyes had gone milky, and he kept the shades half drawn, and he knew her by her voice before she was through the door. "Cordelia Vance," he said. "Thomas's girl. Thomas's widow, Amos." He nodded slow. She told him what she had come for. She told him about Rethmore, and the 600, and the 480, and the coffee cup set on the Bible, and the courthouse steps, and the 11 who would not look. She got to the paragraph, and her voice caught on it, and she made herself go slow. Fenn was quiet a long while. Then he rose, one hand on the desk, and went to a wall of file boxes furred with dust. His fingers walked the labels he could no longer read. He knew them by feel. He pulled a box down and set it on the desk and lifted the lid. 19 and 19, he said. Thomas came in that autumn. Silas was just born. He wanted the walnut stand kept out of the section entire. I told him it was an odd thing to do. He said trees keep growing when the wheat won't. Cordelia sat down hard in the chair. Fenn drew out a carbon, thin and blue and brittle at the fold. He held it to the light of the window and read, and his old voice found the rhythm of the law the way a man finds a rut with a wheel. The stand of black walnut on the west bank of Sand Creek. The trees and the ground beneath them to the depth of their roots. Reserved to the grantor and his heirs. Not conveyed with any sale of the described section. In perpetuity. He lowered the paper. "You understand what this is," he said. "Tell me." "They bought your section. Every acre of dust, every board of the house, every rod of fence." He tapped the carbon. "But the grove was never Thomas's to sell in a bundle. He took it out of the section in 19 and 19. It has its own title now. Separate. When you signed that bill of sale, you sold them the described section. You could not have sold them the grove. It was not in the section to be sold. The room was very still. They own the dust, Fenn said. You own the trees. And you own the ground under them, to the depth of their roots. Cordelia looked at the blue carbon in his spotted hand. Outside, a dog barked once and stopped. Amos, she said. What do I do? He folded the carbon along its old crease. You file, he said. You take this to the register Monday first thing, before that company records one thing more, and you file an affidavit of the reserved timber interest with my carbon attached, and you put it in the book. You do not shout it. You do not go tell Rethmore. You put it in the book, quiet, and you let it sit there like a stone in a field. And you wait for him to run his plow into it. He wrote out the affidavit himself in his slow, blind hand, and she read every word of it aloud back to him so he would know it was right, and she rode home in the dark with it and the carbon flat against her breastbone. Monday she was at the register office when Collie unlocked the door. She said good morning and laid her papers on the counter and paid the filing fee in coins, and Collie, who had looked away on the courthouse steps, looked at her now. What's this, Ms. Vance? A reserved interest, she said. Timber, put it in the book. He read it. His ink-stained cuff moved along the lines. Something crossed his face, and he looked up at her, and then looked down again and said nothing, and stamped it, and wrote it into the book under the Vance section, and it was done. She thanked him. She folded her copy into her apron. She went out into the thin morning and did not smile until she was around the corner. Then she did what a beaten woman does. She let them believe it. She could not keep the house. The house was theirs now. She moved her few things to a rented room over the Cottonwood hardware store, one bed and a washstand and a window that looked down on the street, and she let the town see her carry her boxes up the outside stair. She let Rethmore see it if he cared to. She wanted him to see it. A widow gone to town, run off her land, 60 days early. Beaten and folded up small. Silas helped her carry. He said nothing about the paragraph in front of anyone. He was 19, and he had a way of standing that gave nothing away, and Cordelia thought Thomas would have known that stance. Grandmother, he said, lo, the last trip up the stair. When? Not yet, she said. Let them stake it out. Let them think they've got it all. Then we'll see what they do when they can't. The company did not wait long. Within the month the survey crew came, and they drove their little stakes with the red ragtops in a straight line clean across the Vance section. Straight for Sand Creek, straight through the middle of the Walnut stand. The stakes said the new highway grade would run there. It had to run there. Sand Creek cut a bluff both up and down the section, and there was one soft crossing, and the crossing was the grove. Cordelia walked out one evening and stood among the red rags in her own trees and understood the whole shape of it at last. The thing she had not known that first night at the table. They did not just want the timber. They wanted the ground. The road had to cross the creek, and it could cross it nowhere else, and the ground was hers to the depth of the roots. She went back to town and told no one but Silas and Fenn. There was one bad hour in all of it. A clerk of Pinch's came down from the regional office to check the register before the company let the felling contract, a young man in a celluloid collar. And he stood at Collie's counter running the Vance section, and Cordelia heard of it from Collie himself that same afternoon, come quiet to the foot of her stair with his hat in his hand. He was looking, Ms. Vance, Collie said. Right at your book. Your affidavit's filed under the section, plain as day. Her heart went cold. And Collie turned his hat, and he wrote your reserved interest into his notes under the wrong section number. Off by one. Next section east. He never caught it. He shut the book and caught the noon train. Cordelia stood a moment. Then she laughed, once, a short sound she was ashamed of and could not help. The men who would not read the front page could not read the register either. The trap held. Thank you, Collie, she said. You never had to tell me that. No, ma'am, he said. I reckon I did. And he put his hat on and went. Silas rode to Wichita. It took him 3 days there and back on the train and a borrowed horse, and he came back with a man named Ott, a timber appraiser with a folding rule and a bore and a way of laying his hand flat on the bark of a tree the way a doctor lays a hand on a chest. Ott walked the whole stand along the west bank in the low gold light. He measured. He bored a core here and there and smelled the shavings and rubbed them between his fingers. He counted the trees twice and got 60 both times. "Planted?" he said. 19 and 17, Cordelia said. "The year my grandson was born. My husband set them out along the creek where the water held." Ott nodded. He walked the rows again. "You know what you've got," he said. It was not a question, but she answered it. "Trees, black walnut," he said. "Mature, straight, clear boles, no windshake I can find, grown slow on that creek bottom, which is what you want. This is gunstock timber, Mrs. Veneer, there's a war coming, whatever the papers say, and when it comes they'll want every stick of walnut that stands for rifle stocks and airplane props and the fine faces of things, and there is not enough of it in this country grown to size." He put his rule away. "I'll give you a figure and stand behind it in any court in the state. Give it to me. 60 trees, grayed as they stand, this market and rising." He looked at the creek a moment. $6,300. The number went into her like cold water. 6,300. The company had paid 480 for the whole section, dust and house and fence and all. The trees alone were worth more than 10 times what they had given her for the ground. She let out one breath. That was all. She said nothing. She folded her apron under her hands and looked at the trees Thomas had set out the year the boy was born, and she thought, "Quiet, you old fool, you dry, patient man. You told me, and I called it sentiment." "Say nothing yet," she told Ott, and paid him from the last of her money. And he understood, and went. They came for the trees at dawn. She had known they would. Fen had known. You do not stake a highway grade and then leave the timber standing in the middle of it. They came in the gray light before the sun, 2 wagons and a truck, 6 men with cross-cut saws and axes and a coil of chain, and Rethmore rode ahead of them in the Packard with the section deed rolled in his fist. And there was a company deputy with a badge that Cordelia did not think was any county's badge, and they came down to the west bank of Sand Creek and threw a chain around the oldest walnut, the biggest of the 60, and a man set the saw teeth to the bark. Cordelia was already there. She had been there since well before light. Standing at the creek bank in her black dress with Deacon Fen beside her in a chair Silas had carried down, and Silas standing at her shoulder, and the register book itself open in Collie's arms, for she had sent for the clerk, and the clerk had come. "Ma'am," Rethmore said, and he did not get down from the car at first. "You've no cause to be here. This is company ground." "The section's yours," Cordelia said. "I'll not argue that. Take up your dust and welcome. But you'll take the saw off that tree." Rethmore laughed. He got down then, and unrolled his deed and held it up. "It's all in here. Section, standing and lying. Cut it, Wills, the saw bit." It made that first shrieking sound green wood makes, and Cordelia felt it in her teeth. And for one moment it looked as if all the paper in the county would not stop a saw already in the wood. Then they heard the trucks. They came down the section road in a line, the neighbors' trucks, one behind the other in the dawn, 30 of them and more, the Bakers and the Olins and the Pruitts and men she had known 40 years. And they came because Silas had ridden to every one of them in the night, and they rolled up onto the road above the creek and parked nose to tail in a line and shut off their engines and got down and stood along the bank and said not one word. They just stood. And behind them, last, came the sheriff's car, for Silas had sent for him too. The saw stopped. The man Wills straightened up and looked at Rethmore. The sheriff came down the bank. He was a heavy, slow man named Deacons, and he had known Thomas Vance. "What's the trouble here?" he said. "No trouble," Rethmore said. "We're clearing company ground for the state grade. This woman's obstructing." "That's so," Deacons said, and looked at Cordelia. "Deacon Fenn will read you the deed," Cordelia said. "Not that one. The real one. Collie, hold the book for him." Collie knelt and opened the register book across his knee, and old Fenn leaned to it. And though his eyes were near gone, he did not need them, for he had drawn the words himself in 19 and 19 and read them 100 times since in his mind. But he laid his finger on the line and read as if he saw it. "The stand of black walnut on the west bank of Sand Creek," Fenn read, and his old voice carried in the still morning over the water. "The trees and the ground beneath them to the depth of their roots, reserved to the grantor and his heirs, not conveyed with any sale of the described section. In perpetuity, drawn and filed 19 and 19, filed again by affidavit this spring, and stamped, and in the book before you." The morning was so quiet you could hear the creek. "That grove," Fenn said, lowering his finger, "was taken out of that section 18 years ago. It has its own title. It was never in the section to be sold. This company bought a section that had no walnut trees in it, because the walnut trees had been set aside from the section a decade before they ever came. They own the dust, Sheriff. They do not own one leaf of these trees, nor 1 inch of the ground they stand in." Then the appraiser Ott stepped up out of the crowd, for Silas had fetched him too, and said his piece plain. 60 black walnut, gunstock grade, $6,300 as they stand, Ott said. "I'll swear to it. That's what this company just put a saw to. Timber worth more than 10 times what they paid for the whole section." The number went through the crowd like wind through wheat. Cordelia heard the low sound of it move down the line of neighbors and back. 6,300. On the section they'd all watched her sign away for $480 on the courthouse steps, while a man said, "Dust don't grow money, and neither do widows." "Take the chain off the tree," Deacon said. Nobody moved for a second. Then Wills bent and worked the chain loose, and it slid down the trunk and dropped into the creek mud with a sound like a sigh, and lay there. Rethmore had gone very still. He was looking at his own deed. He had rolled it out flat on the hood of the Packard, and he was reading it, and Cordelia understood, watching him, that he was reading it for the first time. He was a man who read the price line. He had never read the rest. His finger moved down the page the way a schoolboy's does, and it stopped, and she heard him say it under his breath, not to anyone, to himself. "The described section," he said. "It says the described section." He turned the page. He looked for the trees, and the trees were not there, because the trees had never been in the section for him to buy, and the paper that he had waved in her face and read to her like a sentence said only what she had signed and no more. His face went the color of the dust. He took his hat off. He stood in the cool morning with the sweat standing on his forehead and his hat in his hand, and the crowd made its low sound again, and Cordelia did not gloat. She folded her apron under her hands and watched him find the thing that had been under his own thumb the whole time. It was near noon when Pinch came. They had wired him from town, the sheriff had. And the regional counsel came down from the office in a hired car in his good gray suit, and he walked out to the creek bank stiff and careful and would not look at Cordelia at all. He read the register. He read Fenn's carbon that Fenn held out to him. He stood a while with his back to the woman he had bought sight unseen, and then he spoke to the sheriff, not to her. In the flat voice of a man reading a bad column of figures, "The company cannot cut what it does not hold," Pinch said. "The reserved interest is properly filed. It predates our purchase by 17 years. He drew a breath. "Any timber felled here is trespass. The company will bear the damages. I'll direct the crew to stand down." He said it all to Deacons. He signed some paper on the hood of his own car. And through the whole of it he never once turned his head to where Cordelia Vance stood with her grandson at her shoulder, because he was a man who had believed the fine print was decoration, and he could not now look at the woman it had belonged to. But that was not the end of it, and Cordelia had known from the night at the table that it would not be, because there was the matter of the ground. Rethmore came to her at last. He had put his hat back on and taken it off again, and he came across the mud with the deputy's badge nowhere in sight now, and the deputy himself gone off up the bank, and he stood in front of her at the foot of the oldest tree and could not find the beginning of it. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "Mrs. Rethmore, the state grade," he said. "The road. It has to cross the creek." "There's the one crossing," he swallowed. "It's here. Through the grove. We'd need," and he could not say it, so she waited, and made him say it. "We'd need a right of way, across your ground, under the trees." "To the depth of their roots," Cordelia said. Yes, she let the creek run a moment. "I have a price," she said. "Name it." "3 things." She held up no fingers. She said it flat and slow so the whole bank could hear. The neighbors and the sheriff and Collie and Ott and the council Pinch turned half toward her now against his will. 1. You give me back my $480, every cent I signed for on your Packard's hood. 2. The Walnut stays standing. You bend your road around it or under it as the engineers can manage, but you fell not one of these 60 trees. 3. Deacon Fenn draws the easement, in my words, and I read every line before I sign it, and you read every line too, this time out loud, so there's no man here can say he didn't. Rethmore stood with his hat in both hands. "That's the price," Cordelia said. "You bought the dust, Mr. Rethmore. You should have read the line about the trees." Nobody spoke. Down the line of trucks a man laughed low and stopped himself. And old Deacon Fenn, in his chair by the water, reached into his coat and drew out his pen and unscrewed the cap, slow, and turned to a fresh leaf of paper on the flat of the register book Collie still held. Ready to draw the easement then and there, as if he had known all along he would be asked. A year is a long time in a dry country and a short one in a grove of trees. By the autumn of 1937 the kitchen was rebuilt, for the easement money had done that and more, and Cordelia Vance took her coffee on the porch of it in the cool of the morning where she could see the creek. The Walnut stood. Down along the west bank the new highway ran, gray and straight from the north, and then, where it came to Sand Creek, it bent. It curved out and around the grove in a long, easy arc the engineers had cursed and drawn, and crossed the creek below the trees, and straightened again, and went on south, and every soul who drove it slowed at the bend without knowing why, and saw the 60 black walnuts standing in their rows in the bottom land, green and full, and never knew what they had cost or what they had saved. The smell of green walnut hulls was on everything that time of year, sharp and clean, staining the hands of anyone who gathered them. Silas gathered them. He was 20 now and grown into his grandfather's stillness. And he sat on the porch step that autumn morning with a knife and a fallen limb from the oldest tree, the great one they had chained and not cut, a limb the wind had brought down clean in a storm, and he was notching a first careful cut into it, rough and patient, the beginning of a rifle stock he meant to shape over the winter. "Slow," Cordelia said, watching him. "Your grandfather said you never hurry Walnut. It waited 20 years for you. It'll wait a little more." Rethmore had been moved to another county. She heard it in town and did not answer when she heard it. Pinch's bonus for a clean title had been withheld, for the title had not been clean, and the company had swallowed the trespass damages besides, and quietly, that summer, resurveyed its little highway spur to run wide of any tree it did not own. Continental Prairie Land and Development did not come back to Cottonwood County. There had been one letter. It came in the spring with a city postmark, from Rethmore, and it said the things a man says when the whole country has watched him lose to a widow he called dust. She read it once at the table. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box on the shelf. Beside the deed with the paragraph in it, the old deed from 1919, and she did not answer it, and there it stayed, the apology of a man who had not read the fine print, kept next to the fine print itself. The Bible with the coffee ring soaked into its cover sat where it always had, at the end of the kitchen table. She had scrubbed at that ring a dozen times and it would not come out, and she had stopped trying. for it seemed to her now that it belonged there, the mark of the morning a man in a hat had set his cup down on Thomas Vance's book to hold a page he did not understand. Thomas's chair was still at the table. She still set his place at supper some nights, not from grief now so much as habit. And habit is its own kind of love. She would sit across from the empty chair in the rebuilt kitchen and think of the dry, flat voice that had told her, over and over, the things she would not hear. Never sell the walnut, Cordy. Trees keep growing when the wheat won't. He had been right. He had been right in the ground, right in the roots, right in a paragraph an old half-blind lawyer had drawn in a file box 18 years before the men came who never troubled to read it. The wheat had died 2 years running and burned to dust and blown away to Colorado. The trees had grown. They had grown while she starved and while she signed and while a company staked its road across them. And they were growing still, out there in the bend of the highway, green over the creek Thomas had planted them along the year the boy was born. What men take when they never read the line that says they cannot, does not stay taken. She knew that now, and she had learned it late, and she had learned it hard, but she had learned it in the one place it counts, which is in the book, in writing, and out loud where the whole county could hear. She finished her coffee. Down on the step, Silas turned the limb in the light and set his knife to it again, slow, the way he'd been told. If you've ever been written off by the men who never bothered to read the fine print, tell me the name of your town in the comments, and I'll read every one. The spring came in soft that year, which nobody had expected. The rains were not heavy, but they were steady, the kind that soak to depth and do not run off, and the ground drank them down the way tired ground does when it finally gets what it needed. The wheat was still uncertain. It always would be, in that country. You planted and you prayed and you watched the sky and you kept your papers. She had started reading the deed again, not from worry, but from something closer to respect. 2 pages of legal language, the kind that put men to sleep at long tables in offices that smelled of cigarettes and old carpet, and inside those 2 pages was a walnut grove and a woman's name and a sentence that had cost a railroad company its survey stakes and its certainty and finally its dignity in front of a judge who had grown up 15 miles east of where she was sitting. You did not know what you had until you read it. That was the lesson, and she rolled it over in her mind sometimes in the early morning, over coffee, watching the light come across the kitchen floor the way it always had. The same angle in the same season, the way light in an old house will do. Silas was 10 now. He had his father's hands, wide across the knuckles, careful. He had started helping with the ledger, running his finger under the columns and asking what things meant, and she told him. She told him what a survey line was. She told him what a covenant ran with meant, and she told him why a deed was not the same as a promise from a man, which was that a deed was recorded, and a man's promise was only as good as his character and his memory. And neither of those got filed at the county courthouse. He listened the way children listen when they understand that something is being passed to them. She could see it in the way he held still. The walnut trees were visible from the kitchen window if you stood at the right angle, not all of them, but the ones along the creek. The tallest ones that Thomas had planted the farthest back and that were now 30 feet if they were an inch. And in the afternoon the shadow of them reached across the highway and lay on the opposite fence line like a dark hand laid flat. She had grown up afraid of trees. Her mother's people were plains people and they trusted open ground and open sky and believed that a tree was a thing that hid what was coming. She did not believe that anymore. A tree was a record. A tree was the proof that something had stood here long enough to put down roots that no lease agreement could lift. The tin box on the shelf had 3 things in it now. The deed, the letter from Rethmore with its city postmark, and a folded newspaper clipping from the county register, 6 paragraphs on page 4 that mentioned her name twice and the company's name once and ended with a sentence she had read so many times the fold had gone soft at the crease. She had not put it there out of pride, exactly. She had put it there so that if a man ever came to this table again with papers, she could open the box and show him what the last set of papers had come to, and he could decide for himself whether he wanted to sit down. Nobody had come. She did not expect they would. Word travels in flat country, where there is nothing to slow it. She put her cup in the sink and looked out at the morning. Silas had stopped working the limb and was holding it up against the light, turning it the way she turned the deed, reading it with his eyes, learning its grain. A walnut limb in a boy's hand, pulled from the same tree line that had anchored the whole of it, the whole story, the whole argument, the whole case. She watched him a long moment. Some things you pass down in words. Some things you pass down in documents. In the careful language of men who understood that a contract is only as permanent as the paper it's written on, and so they wrote on good paper and they filed it deep. And some things you pass down without any words at all. In the way you show a child how to hold something and turn it and look at it until you understand what it is made of and what it will bear, and what no one can take from you as long as you know exactly what you own. The morning stayed soft. Out along the tree line, the light caught the upper leaves and held there, gold and green, the way it only does in the middle of a good spring. After a long bad stretch, when the ground is finally wet enough and the roots have finally reached something permanent and deep.